Margaret Thatcher's political career has been one of the most remarkable of modern times. Born the daughter of a greengrocer in Grantham, a small market town in eastern England, she rose to become the first and, for 2 decades, the only woman to lead a major Western democracy. She won 3 successive general elections and served as Prime Minister for more than 11 years, from 1979 to 1990, a record unmatched in the 20th century. My final guest tonight is Chris Collins from the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. Now, the foundation was formed in 1991 to advance the cause of political and economic freedom, and Chris joins me on the phone right now. Good evening, Chris.
Hi, hello. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Is there still interest in the Margaret Thatcher legacy?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, she's an unusual figure in being kind of very familiar to people, even decades after she's left office. If you walk down almost any street in any major city in the world and held up a picture of Margaret Thatcher, a fair proportion of people know who you mean, and they know not only who she was, but also roughly what she stood for.
Did she play a large role in the setting up of the foundation? Did you work with her, and did she continue the same sort of convictions after she left office?
Yes, she did. I mean, the foundation was very much her creation. And I started working for her in January 1992, which is about 18 months after she left Number 10, when she started writing her memoirs. I was an Oxford historian, and she needed somebody to help out, really. And I came down for an interview, which was kind of characteristically Thatcherite. I was asked, was I one of us? And treated very kindly. She was worried that I was sitting in a chair that had too much sun, was the sun in my eyes and things like that. She was very motherly. And I was in. And I worked in her office for about 4 years, seeing her pretty much every day and forming a very good view of her. I wondered, actually, as I wanted to, whether I would think as well of her after having met her as I had before. And if anything, it enhanced my view of her, because she was immensely good to work for. And very few people who've actually had close dealings with her in staff terms had anything but kind things to say of her. She was a very considerate, generous person to work for.
And I suppose, that's the problem for any sort of politician, especially, if you look at Gordon Brown, the public only see them through the eyes of the media. They don't really get to see the private individual. You said you went for an interview with her. That must have been very nerve-wracking.
Yes, it was for me, and I think she recognised that and did her best to make it easy. I think it's true, too, that one aspect of her career that's very important, she was, as you said in your introduction, the first woman to reach this kind of level in a Western democracy. And she always felt, probably rightly, that she had to live down the implicit cultural assumption that women weren't up to this kind of job, that they weren't tough enough. And the Iron Lady image, which the Soviets very kindly handed to her on a plate in 1976, when they tagged her that way, was something that worked well for her, but meant that she had to be, in public, adamantine, hard-edged. She was never able, really, to show a kind of more female, feminine, motherly side. But in her personal dealings with people, that's exactly what she's like. She's very motherly. She's very much somebody who looks after you and makes sure that things are going right for you. She's just naturally like that. And it's a bit of a surprise. You don't quite expect that from the Iron Lady.
It's 30 years since Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister or thereabouts. Her private papers for 1979 have been released. These include official papers and private ones, including, for example, memoirs that she wrote from time to time about the Falklands War. Do they give any sort of insight into what she was privately thinking at the time?
I think there are tons of insights. What they show, I think, in 1979 is somebody kind of feeling her way a bit. Naturally enough, she'd only been an education minister before she became Prime Minister. She hadn't held any of the really big offices of state. And she's somebody who has a strong sense of the massive nature of the task ahead of her. She knows that she's confronting problems that have beaten very experienced people before her. Massive numbers of strikes. The Winter of Discontent is still kind of one of the basic reference points of British politics. 30 years on, we still know what that was about. Tremendous economic difficulties, a rooted psychology of decline, a fatalism about the country, which she wanted to turn around. And doing all that without much in the way of direct practical experience of running government was daunting. And you can see in the papers her tremendous efforts to get on top of it, her anxiety about it going wrong, her desire to micromanage. There's a fascinating little thing in June 1979, there was an emergency budget just after the election, and she's actually fiddling around altering the press releases for the budget. And whatever prime ministers do, they shouldn't be fiddling around with press releases. She hadn't at that point got Bernard Ingham, her long-standing press secretary, in the job. And you can see that actually, as she begins to get people around her who she really trusts, so she can ease up a bit on this sort of micromanaging, slightly over-the-top workaholic side. But it's very much there in 79. She's feeling her way. The system is new to her. The machine is pretty alien. She suspects really that lots of civil servants have given up, that they're not serious about tackling the problems. They don't really believe she is either. It's all a bit of a cynical exercise, the management of decline, the orderly management of decline. Somebody wants to define the role of Whitehall as being in those days. All of that's got to be confronted. A tremendous psychological effort is being made. A huge amount is taken on her own shoulders, her loneliness in the job. It's the cliche that the top is lonely, but it's really true. She is just forced to take this on herself. I can see the way that would have burdened her. She wouldn't have wanted to lay it aside. She couldn't have shared it. And yet at the same time, it's a massive thing.
Does it give you an idea of what life is like as a Prime Minister, albeit from, say, 30 years ago? But does it give you an idea about what she would be getting up to on a daily basis, for example, meetings with the security advisors, that sort of thing? Do you get that kind of insight into what it is like to be a Prime Minister?
Yes, we get a lot. And one reason for that is actually, for the first time, a lot of archives from the back office side of Number 10 have survived. Up to 79, we don't have the appointment diaries of Prime Ministers, for example. We don't even know what they were doing with their time. But they survived from 79 onwards. And also the engagement files, the files that were kept by the Secretariat of Number 10, which have usually been junked. They were given to her in 1995 or so by the garden room girls, the people who do all the typing and run the diary in Number 10. And those files give us huge insight into the way the machine actually worked. And you see one thing very interestingly, she's a rather soft touch. She had lots and lots of requests for her time. All Prime Ministers have far more demand for their time than supply. And her diary secretary, quite properly, says, you've got to refuse most of these. And she's always putting notes in saying refuse, reject, regret, all the excuses and so on that she's lining up for the Prime Minister. And Mrs. T is always saying, no, must do this, can't possibly refuse that. Oh, let me take 10 minutes, she says. And she just really actually isn't quite tough enough at the beginning with saying no. And I think, there are good reasons for that. She had political debts to pay. Some of the stuff was good PR. But at the same time, there is just a side of her that is accommodating. Again, the motherly side is there a bit. If somebody asks her a favour, her natural inclination is to say yes. She even sits down sometimes and starts writing letters to members of the public who've written to her, which, given that they're only 24 hours a day, as Prime Minister, you just can't manage. Yeah. And
Margaret Thatcher, the Margaret Thatcher who was the Minister of Education, was different from the Margaret Thatcher who went on to become Prime Minister. There was an image difference. There was a lowering of the voice. There was the hairstyle. There was the sort of clothes that she wore. Do any of the records show how that transition came about and who was pushing that sort of transition to become the Margaret Thatcher that we all knew?
Well, that's a good question. It's a very interesting one, and people often talk about the image. And there's one particular name they bring up here, Gordon Rees, who was a TV producer who worked for the Conservatives on and off in the 1970s. He was kind of a puppeteer in that presentation of it all. He was this guy who kind of molded Margaret Thatcher and made her into this handbag-wielding termagant who ran the British state for a decade. I had kind of bought a lot of that myself, but when I began to see the papers, I did begin to question it a little, because actually, as soon as she becomes Prime Minister, he's bumping in memoranda all the time to her saying, why do you do this, why do you do that? And she just doesn't accept them. A lot of them she doesn't reply to. Others she really shoots the ground from under him. And he does things like, for example, within days of becoming Prime Minister, he suggests that she should be having her face on tea towels and the like. He puts this to one of her officials, not to her. And she just blows up. She's shown this moment and says, no way you're going to put my face on these things. No merchandising, not ever. And though she loves him, she really got on very well with Gordon Rees. They were always on good terms personally. She would refuse really to be managed in quite the way that people have assumed she was being managed. And she hated people talking about her clothes and the like. The stuff from the press office files, which are being released for the first time as well, all the lobby briefings and the like, which have never survived before, we've got them all. We're putting them out online on our website. You can read them all.
What's the website, just quickly, just to get that in?
MargaretThatcher.org.
Yeah, MargaretThatcher.org.
Yeah, all of that stuff shows again and again that she rather resents the personal interest in her. And yet at the same time, she does kind of accept that that's what politics is like, that you can't really avoid it. And she does it herself. She's not totally being managed. I'm not saying she takes no suggestions, but it's a more complicated thing than just somebody pulling the strings. And it shouldn't be a hard sell, this idea that Margaret Thatcher had a mind of her own. She clearly did. And things like clothes and the like actually were very personal to her. She dressed the way she did because that's the way she wanted to look. And actually, interestingly, I think she was very influenced by what women said and thought about her dress. She didn't dress for men. She dressed for other women, really.
Although there were tales from round the cabinet where she could be quite flirtatious with the men, and when she wanted her own way, I'm sure I read somewhere she could melt the hearts of the cabinet just by a look or a flutter.
She could be feminine, and there's no question of that. She's definitely a woman, not a man. I'm not sure that all the members of the cabinet were likely to melt with the flutter of the eyelashes. And,
probably, yeah.
I suspect there were lots of rather rougher times than that. But it's not right to see her as a sort of a man in drag. As the Spitting Image did in the puppet presentation of her. I mean, she was never really that.
One of the last outings that I saw her was when she was invited to 10 Downing Street, I think it was by Gordon Brown. Obviously, they would have political differences, but do you think it's like anything, and unless you've been a Prime Minister, you don't really understand what it's like to be a Prime Minister?
Yeah, that's profound truth. And I think there's a bond between people who've held that job. It's kind of a little bit of a trade union of ex-prime ministers and indeed ex-leaders. I think, you feel a bond with somebody from another country who's been through this. It was rather striking when I was working with it that she had this kind of tie with people who've been in office at the same time as her, not just in Britain. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know what it's like. You've been there, you've done it, and you have a respect for the office. I mean, she has a respect for the office, and I think that will be true of everybody who's ever held it. You want to see it accorded dignity, and you protect it to some degree as well. So if the Prime Minister invites you to number 10, you go, sure.
It was well noted at the time that her departure was very painful for her. When you had joined her and she had been writing her memoirs, did she express it privately to you as well, how difficult that time was?
She didn't talk about it very much. I mean, yes, of course it was very painful. And when it was brought up, I mean, you could see what a shock it had been, how distressing it was, no question. And yet, of course, all political careers come to an end, and I mean, she knew that she couldn't carry on forever. So there's a sense in which there's a bit of a contradiction there. There's an awareness. I mean, we can know things, and yet sort of our emotions can't quite catch up. Intellectually, you can be in one position, emotionally in another, and I think that's how it is, really. If you've entangled yourself in something, you've committed yourself absolutely to it, disentangling, withdrawing is awfully hard.
And one final question, if you will. She was loved by many and hated by just as many as well. Yes. When she was looking back over her life as Prime Minister, did she have any regrets? I think this is a difficult one because politicians find it very difficult to express regret in public. And the reason for that is not that they're, just ridiculously proud people, but because the moment you begin to express regrets, actually your opponents jump on you and say, you've admitted yourself that you were wrong. Yes, there were lots of regrets. There were regrets as to the manner of her departure. I think she did have regrets about things like the poll tax. It hadn't worked out at all as she'd expected. The levels of the tax when it was introduced were vastly higher than she'd been told they would be at the beginning, more than double the level, and things like that were pretty horrible. And the whole thing had come together in a crushing defeat for somebody who was very rightly very proud of her record. So I think she wasn't a regretful person, though there were regrets. I think the fundamental position when I started working for her was one of great pride. You can find a lot of the documents that we've talked about tonight online at the Margaret Thatcher website. The address is www.margaretthatcher.org. Chris Collins, thank you very much indeed. It's been very interesting.
A pleasure. Thank you.